The building was quiet in the early morning, except for the soft sound of footsteps and the gentle echo of cleaning tools moving across the polished floors. The grand music hall stood tall and elegant, filled with beauty that most people only came to admire during evening performances. But before the lights, before the audience, and before the music began, it was just another workplace for a woman who earned her living by cleaning every corner of it. She arrived every day before sunrise. Her hands were tired, her clothes simple, and her life full of responsibilities that never seemed to end. She worked quietly, never complaining, always focused on finishing her tasks before the first visitors arrived. For her, this job was not just work. It was survival. It helped her provide food, shelter, and a better future for her child. Her daughter often came with her because there was no one else at home to take care of her. The girl was still young, full of curiosity about the world around her. While other children spent their time in schools or playgrounds, she spent her mornings inside a place filled with silence, shining floors, and the distant smell of polished wood and cleaning products. At first, she would sit quietly in a corner, watching her mother work. She would observe everything: the way her mother carefully wiped the stairs, how she folded cloths neatly, and how she moved with quiet patience even when her body looked tired. The girl did not fully understand the weight her mother carried, but she felt it in her own small way. The music hall was a place of wonder to her. Massive lights hung from the ceiling like glowing stars. Rows of empty seats stretched out like an endless ocean. And at the center of it all stood something that always caught her attention: the grand piano. It was not just an instrument to her. It looked powerful, almost like it held secrets inside its black polished body. The shine on its surface reflected the lights above, making it look magical. Every time she saw it, she felt a strange pull in her heart, something she could not explain. She had never touched it. She had never even heard anyone explain how it worked. But somehow, she felt like it was calling her. During the day, rehearsals would sometimes take place. Musicians would arrive with serious expressions, carrying sheet music and discussing notes and compositions. The girl would quietly step aside whenever they came. She would stand near the back, pretending to help her mother but actually listening carefully to everything happening around her. The sound of the piano during rehearsals was different from anything she had ever heard in life. It was not like ordinary sounds. It felt like emotions turned into music, sometimes soft and gentle, sometimes strong and powerful. She did not understand the technical side of it, but she understood how it made her feel. It made her feel something deep inside, something warm and heavy at the same time. Without realizing it, she began remembering the patterns of the music. When the same pieces were played again, she could recognize them. She started noticing how certain keys created certain sounds. Even though she had no knowledge of music theory, her mind slowly began connecting sounds like pieces of a puzzle. Her mother never noticed this change at first. She was too busy focusing on her work, trying to complete her tasks on time so she would not lose her job. Life was not easy for her, and every day felt like a race against time and hardship. But she always made sure her daughter stayed close and safe. There were moments when the girl would stand too close to the stage area, and her mother would gently pull her back. She would whisper softly, telling her not to disturb anything, not because she was angry, but because she was afraid something might go wrong. The music hall was not a place for children to explore freely, especially not during working hours. Still, the girl's curiosity only grew stronger. On some days, when the hall was empty and silent, she would sneak a closer look at the piano. She would stand just a few steps away, watching it carefully. She never touched it, but she would imagine what it would feel like to press the keys. Her fingers would twitch slightly, as if trying to copy movements she had seen others perform. She did not know why she felt so connected to it. It was not something she had learned or been taught. It was just there, like a quiet voice inside her mind that kept getting louder every time she saw the instrument. One afternoon, something unusual happened. The cleaning work was almost finished, and most of the staff had already left for a short break. The hall was unusually quiet, even more than usual. The mother was busy cleaning near the side corridors, and the girl was sitting alone near the stage area. She looked around carefully. No one was nearby. The piano stood there in silence, as if waiting. Slowly, she stood up. Her heart beat a little faster, not because she was afraid, but because she felt something she could not explain. Step by step, she walked closer to the instrument. Each step felt heavier than the last, like she was crossing into a place she was not supposed to enter. When she finally reached it, she paused. Her small hands hovered above the keys without touching them. She looked back once to make sure no one was watching. The hall was still empty. Then, with a soft breath, she gently sat down on the bench. The seat felt bigger than her body. She adjusted herself slightly, unsure of what to do next. The piano was so close now that she could see every detail of its polished surface. Her reflection was faintly visible, mixed with the reflection of the ceiling lights. For a moment, she just sat there in silence. Then, slowly, she lifted one hand and pressed a single key. The sound echoed through the empty hall. It was simple, almost uncertain. She paused again, listening carefully to the way the sound faded into the distance. It felt different when she created it herself. She pressed another key, then another. At first, it was random, unsure movements, but something strange began to happen. Her fingers started finding patterns on their own. It was as if her hands were remembering something her mind had never been taught. The sounds slowly started forming a sequence. Not perfect, but strangely emotional. Her confidence grew without her realizing it. The hesitation in her movements began to disappear. The notes became smoother, more connected. She was not playing like a trained musician, but like someone expressing something deeply buried inside her. She did not know it yet, but her life was about to change in a way she could never imagine. She did not even realize how much time had passed while she sat in front of the piano. The world around her seemed to fade away the moment her fingers touched the keys. The empty hall, the tall ceiling, the rows of silent chairs. All of it felt distant, as if it belonged to another place. In that moment, only the sound she was creating mattered. At first, her playing was uncertain. She would press a key, pause, then try another, as if she were slowly discovering a hidden language. But something inside her was changing. Each note she played seemed to guide her toward the next one. It was not planned. It was not learned. It was something deeper, something instinctive. The music she created was simple, but it carried emotion. It was soft in some places, uneven in others, but it had a strange honesty that could not be ignored. Even in the silence of the empty hall, the sound felt alive. She leaned slightly forward, her small hands moving carefully across the keys. Her eyes stayed focused, not on the instrument itself, but on something beyond it, something only she could feel. It was as if she was following a path that only she could see. A faint echo of footsteps suddenly made her pause. Her hands stopped mid-air. For a moment, fear crossed her face. She quickly looked around, her heart beating faster. She thought she might have done something wrong. The piano was not something she was supposed to touch. But after a few seconds, there was no one there. The hall remained quiet. The footsteps were just a distant sound from somewhere outside the room. She slowly relaxed again, though her hands did not immediately return to the keys. She took a deep breath. Then, almost carefully, she pressed another note. This time, the sound felt different. It was stronger, more confident. She tried another combination, then another. Slowly, something began to form. It was not a full melody, but it was no longer random either. It had direction. It had flow. She did not know it, but she was beginning to create something that resembled music in its purest form. Untrained, untouched, but deeply expressive. Outside the hall, life continued as usual. People walked through corridors. Conversations moved from one room to another, and preparations for the next rehearsal were quietly underway. No one paid attention to the empty stage room where a child was sitting alone with a piano. Her mother was still nearby, focused on her work. She was cleaning the side sections of the hall, moving carefully from one corner to another. Her thoughts were heavy, as always. She often worried about money, about stability, about the future. Life had never been easy for her, and every day felt like a quiet struggle. She occasionally looked in the direction of her daughter, making sure she was safe. She trusted her to stay in place as she always did. The girl was usually quiet, obedient, and careful. There was nothing unusual that would raise concern. But inside the hall, something unusual was quietly unfolding. Back at the piano, the girl's curiosity had now turned into focus. She was no longer just experimenting. She was listening. Every note she played, she listened to its effect. When something sounded wrong, she adjusted it. When something felt right, she repeated it. It was not education. It was not instruction. It was observation combined with instinct. Her small fingers moved a little faster now. The hesitation was slowly disappearing. She began connecting sounds in ways she could not explain. A pattern started to form, then fade, then return again in a slightly different way. The piano responded to her touch in ways she did not expect. Sometimes the sound felt soft and warm, sometimes slightly broken, but always meaningful. She tilted her head slightly, trying to understand what she was doing. But there was nothing to understand in the usual sense. It was not something she had learned from books or lessons. It was something that came from within without explanation. For a brief moment, she smiled. Not a big smile, but a small one, like someone who has just discovered something interesting for the first time. She continued playing. Time moved differently for her now. Minutes did not feel like minutes. There was no sense of beginning or end. Only sound, movement, and feeling. Then, something unexpected happened. A door at the far end of the hall opened. Footsteps entered the space, this time clearer, more organized, more noticeable. The girl did not hear them immediately. She was too focused on the piano. But slowly, the sound of approaching people reached her awareness. She paused again, but this time she did not move away. Something inside her told her to stay still. A small group of people had entered the hall. They were dressed neatly, carrying folders, music sheets, and instruments. Their expressions showed confidence and experience. They were used to performing, judging, and analyzing music at the highest level. They had come early for a scheduled rehearsal. At first, they did not notice anything unusual. They were talking quietly among themselves, discussing arrangements and timings. But then one of them stopped walking. A faint sound had caught attention. It was coming from the stage area. They all slowly turned in that direction. The sound of the piano was now clearer. It was not loud, but it was distinct enough to fill the silence of the hall. One by one, they stopped talking. The music they heard was not polished. It was not perfect, but it had something that made them pause. They moved closer without saying anything. And then they saw her. A small child sitting at the grand piano, completely focused, unaware that anyone had entered the room. Her hands were moving gently across the keys, creating a flow of sound that did not belong to training or practice. Felt natural, unforced, honest. The group stood still. At first, they did not speak. They simply listened. The hall, which usually carried the sounds of rehearsals, conversations, and instructions, was now filled with something completely different. A raw expression of emotion coming from a child who had never been trained. One of them exchanged a glance with another, unsure of what they were witnessing. It was not about technical perfection. It was something else entirely. The girl continued playing, unaware of the attention she had gathered. She was still lost in her own world, still following the flow she could not explain. And in that moment, something unusual happened among the listeners. Their expressions began to change. Confusion slowly turned into interest. Interest turned into surprise. And surprise quietly began turning into something deeper, something close to admiration. They were not reacting to skill. They were reacting to feeling. And that was something far more powerful than anything they expected to find that day. The hall remained unusually silent, but not the kind of silence that felt empty. This silence was full of attention, full of surprise, and full of something that no one in the room could immediately explain. The group of visitors stood near the entrance, still watching the small child at the piano. She had not noticed them yet. Her focus stayed on the keys, on the sounds she was creating, and on the invisible path her fingers seemed to follow. She was no longer pressing notes one by one. Now there was flow. There was rhythm. There was something beginning to resemble a real piece of music, even though no one had ever taught her how to build it. Her small shoulders moved slightly as she leaned into the piano. Her face showed complete concentration. There was no performance in her mind, no awareness of being watched. For her, this was still discovery, still exploration, still something private. But for the people behind her, everything had changed. One of them slowly stepped forward, careful not to disturb the moment. The sound they were hearing was not what they expected to find in a place like this. It was not rehearsed. It was not polished. It was raw, but it carried emotion in a way that felt rare. Another person raised a hand slightly, signaling others to stay quiet. No one spoke. No one interrupted. They simply listened. The piano keys moved under her fingers with increasing confidence. At first, there had been hesitation, like someone testing water before stepping in. Now there was movement that felt natural, almost as if her hands had remembered something forgotten. The melody was not structured in a formal way, but it had direction. It rose and fell like breathing. Sometimes it felt soft, almost fragile, and at other moments it carried a surprising strength for someone so small. The visitors exchanged glances again. None of them could deny what they were hearing. One of them had spent years performing on stages across different cities. Another had trained students for decades. Others had judged competitions where only the best were allowed to perform. Yet here, in a quiet rehearsal hall, they were standing still because of a child who had never been part of any formal training. The girl suddenly paused for a brief moment. She tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. Then she continued again, this time with a different pattern. It was subtle but noticeable. She was not repeating randomly anymore. She was building. The sound became smoother, more connected, more expressive. It was as if she was no longer searching for notes, but instead allowing them to come naturally. One of the visitors quietly leaned closer to another and whispered something, but even that whisper felt too loud in the silence of the hall. They quickly stopped again and returned their attention to the music. The child's hands moved across the keyboard in a way that seemed effortless. Her small fingers pressed keys with a rhythm that did not match her age or experience. There was no sheet music in front of her. No instructions. No guide. Only instinct. And yet it worked. From a distance, it almost looked like she had been doing this for years. The sound filled the hall more now. It was no longer faint. It was present in every corner, bouncing off the tall walls and returning gently like an echo. At that moment, the door at the back of the hall opened again. A woman stepped in quietly, holding a cleaning cloth in one hand. Her expression was tired, as it usually was after hours of work. She had come looking for her daughter, expecting to find her sitting quietly in a corner like always. But what she saw made her stop immediately. Her daughter was sitting at the grand piano. And she was not just sitting, she was playing. The woman froze for a second, unsure of what she was seeing. Her mind struggled to process the scene in front of her. She had never seen her child touch the piano before. She had always assumed it was just something the girl looked at out of curiosity. But now there was music. Real music. Her first instinct was to rush forward and stop her, worried that she might be disturbing something important. But before she could move, she noticed something else. People were watching, not in anger, not in confusion, but in silence. And that silence carried weight. She hesitated. Her steps slowed. She slowly looked around and noticed the group standing near the entrance. Their expressions were not annoyed. They were not distracted. They were focused on her child. That made her pause completely. Back at the piano, the girl continued playing. She still had no idea she was being watched so closely. Her world remained small and focused only on sound and feeling. But something subtle was changing in her expression. There was a slight shift in confidence. Her shoulders relaxed a little more. Her movements became smoother. It was as if she had started trusting herself without even realizing it. The music shifted again. This time it became softer, more emotional, less structured, but more expressive. Felt like a story without words. A story that was not being told through language but through sound alone. One of the visitors closed their eyes for a moment, listening deeply. Another quietly folded their arms, still unsure whether what they were hearing was real or not. But it was real. Every note, every pause, every shift in tone. It was all coming from the same source, a child sitting alone at a piano in a quiet hall. The mother slowly moved closer to the side of the room, still unsure whether she should interrupt or stay back. Her eyes stayed fixed on her daughter. She had never seen her look so focused before. There was something different in her expression, something calm but powerful in its own way. The visitors remained still. No one wanted to break the moment. The girl's fingers slowed slightly. The music softened again. It felt like the piece was coming to an end, even though it had no defined beginning or structure. She pressed a final set of notes gently, then paused. Her hands stayed on the keys for a moment, and then she slowly lifted them away. Silence returned. But this time it was different. It was not empty. It was full. Full of something no one could immediately describe. The girl finally looked up. For the first time, she noticed the people standing behind her. Her expression changed instantly. Confusion, surprise, a small sense of fear. She did not know how long they had been there. She did not know what they had heard. She only knew she had been playing, like she always felt drawn to do. Her hands slowly moved away from the piano as she shifted slightly on the bench. The room remained silent for a few more seconds. No one spoke. Not yet, because everyone in that hall had just witnessed something they could not easily explain. The silence in the hall felt heavier than before. It was not the same quietness that usually came after rehearsals or performances. This silence carried emotion, confusion, and disbelief all at once. The small child was still sitting at the piano, her hands now resting carefully in her lap. She had turned slightly on the bench, her eyes moving between the people standing behind her and the piano in front of her, unsure of what was going to happen next. For a few moments, no one said anything. The group of visitors remained where they were, still processing what they had just heard. Their expressions were a mixture of surprise and deep thought. Some of them looked at each other, trying to find answers without speaking. Others kept their eyes fixed on the child, as if looking at her a little longer might help them understand what they had just experienced. It was not confusion about whether the music was real. It was real. There was no doubt about that. The confusion came from something else. How could something so untrained sound so complete in emotion? How could someone so young, with no visible training, create something that made even experienced musicians stop and listen without moving? One of them finally stepped forward slowly. The movement was careful, respectful, as if they were afraid that even a small sound might break the fragile moment that still hung in the air. The child noticed the movement and straightened her back slightly. Her small hands tightened together in her lap. She did not speak. She did not know what to say. Another person followed, then another. Soon, the group was standing closer to the piano, forming a gentle half-circle around the child. None of them were aggressive or loud. Their presence was calm, but it carried seriousness. The mother, who had been standing near the side of the hall, felt her heart beating faster. She slowly stepped forward, her cleaning cloth still in her hand. Her eyes moved from her daughter to the group of visitors. She could sense that something important was happening, something far beyond her understanding. One of the visitors finally spoke, but in a soft voice. The words were not harsh. They were not questioning in a negative way. They were more like a careful attempt to understand what they had just witnessed. The child did not respond immediately. She looked at her mother first, as if seeking permission or reassurance. The mother gently nodded without speaking. That small gesture gave the child a little comfort. She turned her attention back to the visitors, still unsure. Another person crouched slightly to bring themselves closer to her eye level. Their expression was kind, not intimidating. They asked a simple question about the piano, about how long she had been playing. The child hesitated. She looked at her fingers for a moment, then back at the piano. Her answer was soft and uncertain. She explained that she had never really been taught. She had only watched others and listened. That answer made the group exchange looks again. There was a quiet realization forming among them, something they were slowly beginning to accept but still struggling to believe fully. One of them stood up straight again and looked toward the mother. The conversation shifted gently, now including her. They asked about the child's exposure to music, whether she had ever taken lessons, whether anyone in the family had a musical background. The mother shook her head slowly. She explained in simple words that they lived a modest life. Music was not something they had access to. The piano was something they only saw because of her work in the hall. She had never imagined her daughter would ever touch it, let alone play it. As she spoke, her voice carried both pride and confusion. She had just witnessed something she could not explain about her own child. The visitors listened carefully. There was no judgment in their expressions, only curiosity and growing respect. One of them turned back toward the piano and looked at the child again. She was still sitting quietly, her feet not even reaching the floor completely. She looked small in comparison to the instrument, yet there was something about her presence that had changed the way everyone in the room saw her. It was not about appearance anymore. It was about what they had heard. Another visitor slowly walked toward the piano and stood beside it, looking at the keys. They gently pressed a single note. The sound echoed softly in the hall. Then they looked at the child and asked her to try again. Not as a test, not as a performance, but as a simple request. The child hesitated again. She glanced at her mother, then at the group. Slowly, she placed her hands back on the keys. At first, she did not play immediately. Felt different now. She was aware of the eyes on her. The silence felt heavier than before. But after a few seconds, she pressed a key. Then another. The sound returned, but this time it was softer, more careful. She was no longer lost in her own world. She was aware of the people around her, and that changed the way she played. Even then, something remarkable happened. Even with hesitation, the flow was still there. The visitors listened again, more closely this time. They were not just hearing notes. They were analyzing, feeling, and trying to understand the source of what they were witnessing. One of them quietly said that what they were hearing was not technique, but instinct. Another added that it was something they rarely came across, even in trained performers. The child continued playing for a short while, then slowly stopped again. She removed her hands from the keys and looked down. The moment ended, but its effect remained. The group remained silent for a few seconds longer before slowly stepping back. There was a sense that something important had just been discovered, but not yet fully understood. One of them spoke again, this time suggesting that the child should be given an opportunity to explore music properly. The words were careful, respectful, and directed toward the mother. The mother stood still for a moment, absorbing everything. She looked at her daughter, then at the piano, then back at the group. Her life had always been simple and focused on survival. Opportunities like this were not something she had ever imagined. But now, standing in this hall, she was being told something that felt almost unreal. Her daughter had talent. Not ordinary talent. Something rare. Something that had been noticed by people who understood music deeply. The child did not fully understand what was being discussed. She simply sat quietly, watching faces change around her. She only knew that something had shifted, something she could not name. The visitors slowly began to step back, still talking quietly among themselves. Their tone was serious, but there was excitement hidden beneath it. The mother walked closer to her daughter and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. The child leaned slightly toward her, feeling a sense of safety return. The hall slowly returned to a calmer state, but nothing felt the same anymore. Something had happened in that quiet room. Something that would not be forgotten easily. And even though no one said it out loud yet, everyone understood one thing clearly. This was only the beginning. The atmosphere in the hall slowly began to settle, but it was no longer the same as before. Something had changed that could not be reversed. The cleaning tools were still in the corner, the lights were still shining above the stage, and the grand piano still stood exactly where it had been. But now everything felt different, as if the space itself had absorbed what had just happened. The child was still sitting near the piano, holding onto her mother's hand. Her fingers were slightly tense, as if she was still trying to understand whether what had just taken place was real or only a dream. She kept looking around quietly, noticing that the people who had once been strangers were still there, still talking softly among themselves. Her mother stood close beside her, not saying much. Her mind was full of thoughts she could not organize properly. Only a short time ago, she had been focused on cleaning and finishing her work like any other day. But now she was standing in a situation she had never imagined. Her daughter, the same child who used to sit quietly while she worked, had just played music that made experienced people stop and listen. One of the visitors stepped forward again, this time holding a calm expression. They spoke gently, addressing both the mother and the child. The words were not rushed. They were careful, as if every sentence mattered. They explained that what they had heard earlier was not ordinary. They said it in simple terms so it could be understood easily. It was not about perfection or training. It was about natural ability, something that could not be easily taught or created through practice alone. The mother listened quietly. She looked down at her daughter for a moment, then back at the person speaking. She did not fully understand all the technical words, but she understood the emotion behind them. There was seriousness in their tone, but also admiration. Another visitor joined the conversation. They suggested that the child should not be ignored or left without guidance. They spoke about the importance of nurturing talent when it appears, especially when it is rare. Their voice was calm, not demanding, but there was conviction in what they said. The mother shifted slightly, feeling the weight of the moment. Her life had always been simple and focused on daily survival. She had never been in a situation where people spoke about opportunity in such a serious way regarding her child. She looked at her daughter again. The child was still quiet. She was listening, but not fully understanding everything being said. She only knew that the attention around her felt different. It was not the usual kind of attention she experienced in daily life. Felt heavier, more meaningful. One of the visitors crouched slightly again to speak directly to her in a gentle voice. They asked if she liked playing the piano. The question was simple, not complicated. The child thought for a moment before nodding slightly. She did not say much, but her expression changed a little when she looked back at the piano. There was something in her eyes that showed curiosity rather than fear. It was not confidence yet, but it was interest. The visitor smiled slightly and stood up again. The conversation continued among the adults. They discussed possibilities not in a way that felt overwhelming, but in a way that slowly built direction. They suggested training, exposure, and learning opportunities. They mentioned that with proper guidance, what they had witnessed could develop into something even greater. The mother listened carefully, her hands still resting gently on her daughter's shoulder. Every word felt important but also heavy. She was not used to thinking about the future in such terms. Her focus had always been on getting through each day. But now, for the first time, she was being asked to think beyond that. The idea of her daughter learning music properly felt both exciting and uncertain. It was something she had never considered possible. The child shifted slightly and leaned closer to her mother. She could feel the change in energy around her even if she did not fully understand it. The attention, the discussion, the seriousness, it was all unfamiliar to her. One of the visitors stepped back and looked at the piano again. They gently placed a hand on it, as if remembering the sound it had just produced through a child's hands. There was a quiet admiration in their expression. Another visitor spoke softly about how rare it was to see someone respond to music so naturally without training. They said that most people spend years learning technique, but very few develop such instinctive emotional connection. The mother heard these words, and they stayed with her. She looked at her daughter again, this time more carefully. She remembered how the child used to quietly watch rehearsals, how she would sit silently, observing everything. At the time, it had seemed like simple curiosity. Now it felt like something more meaningful. A decision was beginning to form in the room, but no one rushed it. Instead, the visitors suggested something simple first. They proposed that the child should be given a chance to learn, to explore music in a structured way, without pressure. They said she should not be forced, but guided gently, so her natural ability could grow. The mother remained silent for a moment. She looked down at her hands, then at her daughter's small fingers resting near hers. Life had never given her many choices before. Everything had always been about necessity. But now she was being offered something different. Opportunity. She slowly looked back at the group and asked a simple question. She wanted to know what kind of commitment this would require, and whether it would be realistic for someone like her. The visitors responded calmly. They explained that nothing would be immediate or overwhelming. It would begin slowly with basic guidance and observation. They assured her that support would be provided. The child listened quietly to this exchange. She did not fully understand the meaning of all the words, but she could sense that something important was being decided about her. She looked at the piano again. This time there was a slight change in her expression. Not excitement exactly, but curiosity mixed with something softer. The idea of returning to the piano did not feel strange anymore. One of the visitors gently placed a card in the mother's hand. They explained it contained contact information for further discussion. They said there was no pressure to decide immediately. The mother held the card carefully, almost as if it was something fragile. The group slowly began to step back. Their discussion became quieter as they prepared to leave the hall. But even as they moved away, they continued to glance back at the child, as if trying to make sense of what they had just experienced. The hall began to return to its usual stillness. But nothing about it felt usual anymore. The mother finally knelt down beside her daughter. She looked into her eyes and asked softly if she had enjoyed playing. The child nodded again, a little more clearly this time. There was a small pause. Then the mother gently smiled. It was a tired smile but also a hopeful one. She did not make any decision in that moment. She did not promise anything. But something had shifted inside her. For the first time, she was thinking not only about survival but about possibility. And in the background, the grand piano stood silently, as if waiting for what would come next. The days after that moment in the music hall did not feel the same for the mother and her daughter. Even though life around them continued in its usual way, something inside both of them had quietly shifted. The cleaning work still needed to be done, the long hours were still there, and responsibilities had not disappeared. But now, there was something new sitting beside all of that. Possibility. First, nothing changed immediately. The mother continued her work in the hall, moving from room to room with the same careful effort she always gave. The grand piano still stood on the stage, silent most of the time, as if waiting patiently. And the child still came with her, sitting quietly during breaks, watching everything around her with a different kind of attention now. But the difference was inside her. She no longer looked at the piano as something distant or unreachable. It felt closer now, like something she had already touched once in a different way that she could not forget. The card given by the visitor stayed carefully folded inside the mother's small bag. She would take it out sometimes, look at it quietly, and then put it back again. She was not used to making decisions that could change the direction of life. Every choice she had ever made before was about getting through the next day. This was different. This required thinking beyond survival. One evening, after finishing work, she sat with her daughter outside the hall. The air was calm, and the noise of the city was far away. The child sat beside her, swinging her feet slightly, looking at the ground and then at her mother. The mother finally spoke about the visit from the visitors. She explained in simple words what they had said. She told her daughter that they believed she had something special, something that could grow if given the right care. The child listened carefully. She did not fully understand everything, but she understood enough to know that people had paid attention to her playing. That thought made her quiet for a moment. Then she asked softly if she would have to leave her mother if she went to learn music. That question stayed in the air for a while. The mother did not answer immediately. She gently placed her hand on her daughter's shoulder and told her that nothing would happen without understanding and comfort. She said no decision would be made without thinking carefully. But inside, she already knew that this was not a simple situation. Over the next few days, she thought about it constantly. While working, while resting, even during small quiet moments, her mind kept returning to that hall. to the sound of the piano, and to the expressions on the faces of those who had listened. She remembered how they had stopped everything just to hear her daughter play. She remembered the silence that followed, not empty silence, but full silence. The kind that comes when something unexpected touches people deeply. One morning, she decided to visit the hall again during a quieter time. The child came with her as usual. The piano was still there, still waiting. The mother stood near the side of the hall, watching as her daughter slowly walked closer to the instrument again. This time, there was no hesitation. The child sat down gently on the bench, adjusting herself just like before. She placed her hands on the keys, and she played. It was different from the first time. Not because it was more complex, but because it was more relaxed. There was less fear, less confusion. Her movements were softer, more natural. The sound filled the hall again, not loudly, but gently, like a quiet conversation between her and the instrument. The mother stood still. She listened, and for the first time, she did not see confusion in what her daughter was doing. She saw connection. It was not about skill yet. It was about expression. Something real. Something honest. When the child finished, she looked back at her mother with a small, uncertain expression. The mother slowly walked toward her and sat beside her on the edge of the stage. She did not speak immediately. She simply looked at the piano, then at her daughter, then back at the piano again. After a long pause, she finally said that maybe it was time to learn more about this path. Not as something forced, not as something rushed, but as something explored step by step. The child did not fully understand the weight of those words, but she understood the feeling behind them. A few days later, the mother made a decision. She contacted the people who had visited the hall. The conversation was simple at first. They spoke about starting slowly without pressure. They explained that learning would not interfere with the child's natural curiosity, but would instead guide it. The mother agreed to a trial period. Nothing dramatic changed overnight. There were no sudden transformations, no instant shifts in life. Instead, there were small steps. The child began visiting a small learning space connected to music practice. At first, she only observed. She listened to simple lessons, watched others play, and slowly became familiar with the structure of music. Sometimes she would still think about the grand hall piano. But now, she was also beginning to understand smaller things. How sounds connect. How rhythm works. How silence is also part of music. Her learning was not forced. It was gentle. And because of that, it felt natural to her. The mother continued working in the hall, but now she carried something different inside her. She no longer saw her job as just survival. She saw it as part of a journey that had unexpectedly opened a door for her daughter. One afternoon, a few weeks later, the child was allowed to sit at a piano again during a guided session. This time, she was not alone. There was someone nearby watching quietly, ready to help if needed. But the child did not seem nervous. She placed her hands on the keys and began slowly. The sound was simple, but it was controlled. There was improvement, but more importantly, there was comfort. She was no longer afraid of making mistakes. She was exploring. The person guiding her observed quietly, noting how quickly she adapted without losing her natural expression. After the session, they spoke with the mother again. They said that progress was not about speed, but about consistency, and that the child had something that could not be taught easily, natural emotional connection. The mother listened carefully. She did not celebrate too early. She did not assume anything, but she allowed herself to feel a small sense of hope. As days turned into weeks, the child continued learning. Sometimes she would still play in her own way, sometimes she would follow structure. Both were important. The balance between freedom and guidance slowly began to shape her growth. One evening, after another practice session, the child and her mother walked back home together. The sky was soft with fading light. The child held her mother's hand more tightly than usual. She said she liked the piano, not because she was told to, but because she felt something when she played. The mother smiled quietly. It was a small moment, but it carried weight, because in that moment, she realized something important. Life had not changed because everything became easy. It had changed because a door had opened where there was once only silence. And inside that silence, a small voice had been heard. A voice that came not from training or privilege, but from a child who simply sat at a piano one day and let her heart speak through sound.